Right. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming along today. It's really good to see so many people. There are a few reasons for putting on a sort of afternoon length disruptive bites. One being that we obviously want to get really good speakers in, and Pete Byron is definitely one of those. But also, we wanted to sort of say thanks really to people that we've worked with over the last year, and get you kind of chatting to one another and showing us what you've done. And because some of the projects that have come out of the lab are just really, really exciting. So we're looking forward to letting you showcase your work to one another. So the structure is going to be as follows. We're going to have Pete talking to us now. Good, it is on silent. We're going to have Pete talking to us now for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, then we can have questions. Pete's head of learning technology and innovation at the London School of Economics. Before that, he was a principal lecturer in educational technology at the University of Greenwich. So I've known Pete for a few years now, and he's a really interesting and exciting person in higher education. And what I really like about Pete's work is the way that it kind of really does straddle those boundaries between the kind of strategic, organisational level, and then also as a kind of experimenter and innovator. I think Pete's really kind of open to new ideas and writes brilliantly about some of the more exciting things going on in education at the moment and in his blog. So yeah, that's Pete. One thing that I do want to point out is just that we do have another Disruptive Bites session coming up on the 18th of June, and that's going to be with Danny Carroll from the University of South Wales in Australia, and that's going to be on flipped learning in community. So please do come along to that. There will be further details on the website. Before I pass you over to Pete, just to briefly summarise the kind of structure of today, we'll be here till sort of 2 o'clock with Pete's talk and questions and answers. Then 30 minutes refreshment break, and then another hour in here for the Ignite presentations, which are looking really interesting, actually, very disruptive. No one followed the careful instructions I sent out. No, it's good. But we've got Adrian presenting from his Pico projector. Situated presentation about situated learning in a situated environment. It's kind of meta situation wormhole, so quite like that. We've got lots of interesting movies coming up. We've got a rap as well, and yeah, various presentations. So that's going to be good. And then after that, some well-deserved wine and further refreshments. So, without further ado, pass over to Pete.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Helen for inviting me. I think I'm now returning 2 favours where Helen's come and talked for us at both Greenwich and LSE. So as she said, my name is Peter Bryant. I'm the head of learning technology innovation at the London School of Economics. I've called this presentation Little Arguments with Myself, and I'll come to why I've called it that right at the end. Although if any of you are fans of a particular Minneapolis band, you may know that quote. I've subtitled it, and my wife, when she looked at this today, said, God, that's a long subtitle. I told her it's 2 sentences, so that makes it a little bit better. I've called it Discontinuity, Fleeting Connections and Digital Strangers, Disrupting How We Do Learning in a Post-Digital World. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit about sort of my philosophy of how technology has disrupted learning, and how, more particularly, how it's disrupted how we do learning rather than the actual practice of teaching and learning. And it's built up on a number of projects and experiences I've had over the last nearly 25 years, but certainly over the last 4 or 5 years at both Greenwich and at the LSE. It's about how we challenge practice and how we challenge the assumptions that drive practice, and how we as people who are interested in innovation share that with other people, not in a kind of, well, we're doing it, why aren't you way, but share it in a way that actually is supportive to their experimentation with things that are interesting to them and their students. And in some senses, it's about the role of the institution being repositioned. I've used the current sort of word de rigueur, which is the notion of something being post-digital, which is the idea that we're kind of past digital being different It's normalized. So we're now not dealing with how is online learning different from learning. It's just learning. I've stopped using the word e-learning because to me it's about the learning, and the E is just a mode. That's all it is. So that's me, which you can probably tell because I'm here. That's my blog that Helen mentioned before. My background, just to give you some sort of introduction to that, I started in Australia, you might have told by my accent, where I worked in vocational education for about 15 years. And the interesting part of vocational education in Australia, as it has become here, is it's very driven by competencies. So it's competency-based learning, and it's very driven by learning how to do something. But what it is most driven by, particularly in Australia, and when I first started teaching it is driven by where you learn how to do something in and through work. So I have adapted that across various disciplines I've worked in, and I don't talk about learning at work, I talk about learning through practice. And that's where that's all come from. What the common factor across this, I worked at Middlesex in web-based learning, I worked at Greenwich as I said, as Helen said, as a principal lecturer in educational technology, and at LSE, heading their learning technology innovation unit. What's common to all of these is that in every one of them, the debate around change in education still is around the term potential. We talk about the potential that technology will change education, the potential that jobs are changing, so therefore our education needs to change. What I think is really interesting is that what that also demonstrates is that most institutions have an equilibrium point of practice, of how they do things, and it's very hard to shift institutions from that equilibrium point. And in most instances, you get something like the MOOC hype, for example, which shifted institutions really rapidly, but equally rapidly back to where they were before, with very little shifts. I'm hearing across some of my Russell Group contemporaries that funding for technology-led learning in institutions is on the decline again. So in big institutions, I won't name names, but big institutions have had budgets cut in an environment when you would have thought that MOOCs would have transformed even the Vice-Chancellor's views of education with technology. What I'm interested in to talk about today, I guess, is to tell a bit of a story. I mean, Helen mentioned sort of what I do as a background. Outside of my practice as an academic, I'm a sound artist, I do podcasts and radio, and I'm really interested in some of the things that have come out of my academic practice and how that represents itself in what I sort of can freely talk about, as opposed to what I have to couch in slightly more guarded terms in my practice, although my blog is less guarded because it has the standard disclaimer that this is none of my institution's business, which they buy, which is fantastic. To me, the sort of key theme of the debate we're having is unfortunately a theme of conflict. In most institutions, there is a conflict. And in some senses, it is a debate without winners, because those who innovate, those who don't, are always feeling, sometimes feeling quite polarized with each other. Positions are becoming entrenched, which is quite strange, I think, but certainly in my observation over the last 10 or 15 years, those positions have become far more entrenched. And the power that the institution wields through its ability to certify and accredit, which is the sole power that institutions have outside of informal learning, or certainly the sole power institutions believe they have outside of informal learning, has made this polarization more complex. So, really simple question. And that question is about, why do we need to be even talking about this? I posed this question to my Deputy Vice-Chancellor Teaching and Learning yesterday, who answered interestingly. His first response was, at an institution like the LSE, we don't need to be talking about this. We have 13 students for every undergraduate place, and that's in the lower end courses, in the upper end courses like economics, it's between 30 to 50 students for every place. Having come from a university like Greenwich, which is about widening participation, it's a post-92 institution, it's driven by, as I'm sure most institutions are, student retention and student achievement. They are not factors at an institution like the LSE. We don't have a student retention problem. And student achievement, we have whole departments at the LSE who do not grant first-class degrees. They've never given a first-class degree. One department, names shall not be mentioned, has never given a first-class degree in its 120-year history. Because everyone knows that a 2-1 from the LSE is a first-class degree from within that particular scenario. So I asked him this question, because I thought I'm presenting here today, and I asked him this question. Why? Why do we need to be talking about pedagogical change? His answer, firstly, was we don't. And then he thought about it, thought, well, actually, my title is Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Teaching and Learning. I probably should think about that question. He started to realise that the competitive circumstances under which every institution is operating in are moving at a far faster pace than they ever have. You know, we look at the most recent Guardian League tables. The LSE is now 13. That did cause some ructions, I can tell you. You've got universities like Bath that have had 5-year programs of thinking about pedagogical innovation that are paying off and have them in the top 10. Those institutions have actually had that debate. And you talk to the Vice-Chancellor of Bath and he says, well, how did this happen? The THE asked him. He said, well, firstly, we listened to students, which seems to me to be a relatively simple concept, but we listened to students and we made changes to the way the pedagogy worked. We didn't give them everything that they wanted. We listened to what they want. We listened to what our employers, because obviously employability is a big factor in the Guardian League tables, and we listened to what we think education should be about, and then we delivered that. And their student experience scores went through the roof. Their student retention went through the roof. Their student achievement went through the roof because they thought about the pedagogical approaches that they were underpinning their practice. What makes this difficult is a couple of things. One, the notion of what I would refer to as historical revisionism. The idea that this is the way we've always done education, so why should we change? Now, at many institutions, the single most sacred form of teaching is the lecture. And they'll go back and talk about it as the Socratic tradition and it's worked for 2,000 years. The modern large-scale lecture is a 1950s construct. You know, you get 400 or 500 people in a room. You couldn't do that without the technology that allowed you to do that. Large-scale projection, voice projection, you know, construction ability to build a 400 or 500 seat theatre. All of those factors are not Socratic. It's defending something that's not necessarily as new as old as it seems. The thing I refer to as the watering down of technology. That technology is often seen, that people say, oh, look, yeah, I use technology in my classroom. I use YouTube. Well, what you're using YouTube for is to just replace the old VHS that you used to use. And apart from the fact you probably had the legal right to use the VHS and perhaps you're not using something for which you have copyright on YouTube, that doesn't come into the debate. You're just replacing existing technology, old technology with new technology. And in some senses, the final part of this, and this scale isn't particularly simple, and I don't make it out to be, but there is actually quite a bit of demeaning of online education as an inferior form of teaching and learning. You know, I sat in a meeting with a number of academics last week where there wasn't even an argument that it wasn't an inferior form. It was just a clearly accepted fact by everyone in that room except for me. But there is kind of this thing that it's an inferior experience, face-to-face is a superior experience. Neither of them are inferior and neither of them are superior. It's all about context, but that debate seems to be prevalent in many institutions. What this manifests itself as 3 simple behaviours in most institutions. One is the notion of resistance, that we resist technology, we resist change, we do whatever we can to defend the walls against the marauding hordes. You then have another behaviour, which is one I mentioned before about replacement or replication. Well, of course I'm using technology, but all I'm using it for is to replace existing practice. And, you know, I get a lot of people who say, oh, well, you know, I'm innovative, I use Moodle. Well, what do you use Moodle for? I put up my slides and I put up my reading list. It's not really that innovative. And the third thing, which I perhaps rather casually refer to as recidivism, is where people will try technology once and then go back to reoffending with their old practices, saying, well, I tried technology, it doesn't work. And that resistance is even harder to fight or to counter, because it's like, well, I've done it. It failed on me. We did an e-exam pilot a few weeks ago where we had 40 people in a room accessing a pilot to type in their exams. The Wi-Fi failed on that. It shouldn't fail, because it should be 5 devices per student, but it failed. That academic said to me, well, we're never doing that again. Go back to paper now. We're done. So those things make the debate around why we should change difficult, because it's often couched in the term of, well, you're the zealot. And I hate the term zealot, because, yeah, like the word fanatic, it comes from a root that actually perhaps isn't as particularly positive as its usage, or perhaps is not as positive as its usage is used as. So for me, at the 2 institutions I've worked at, this debate has occurred in very similar ways, despite being very different institutions. You know, a Russell Group and a Post-92 are very different institutions on the service, but this debate occurs in the same way. Resistance, replication, and recidivism seem to be driving the debate about why we should be talking about innovation in terms of teaching and learning. But it is critical. In the US, there's an organization called the Apiary. What the Apiary do is they go to every single institution that's providing free content, and they are not small institutions. Every single course from MIT is online for free and has been for almost 2 decades. They go there, they get that material, they hire good teachers to teach it, and then deliver not a degree from an institution, they deliver a certified piece of training. In certain fields, that is outranking the institution for employability, particularly in the area of coding, in the area of computer science. They are outranking the institution whose materials they just used and recognize that they did. This is not as simple as it seems for institutions to rest on the laurels of certification and credentialization. So for institutions, we come up with this debate about how they actually do learning. Now, I could talk about teachers here, and I'm not going to, for a simple reason that I am passionately of the belief that 99% of teachers, that if you sit down with them and talk about something that is good for their students, they will do that. There are resistors and there are people who will have the argument. It's not the teachers where this resistance to doing learning in a different way comes from. It's from the institutions itself. And I think this is where this gets interesting. So within institutions, you have institutional resistance to change. How has that manifested itself? It's manifested itself as rusted on designs of teaching and learning spaces. It's manifested itself as rusted on policies and procedures, which have become government policies and procedures through QAA audits and through KISS statements and HESA returns, and all of those things all drive the sort of rusted on model of teaching and learning. We then build into the way we accredit, validate, and eventually quality assure courses, this process of, I'm sure all of you have done any study in education and know of Biggs's constructive alignment. Learning outcomes lead to teaching, strategies lead to assessment. That is rusted into institutional practice, for better or for worse. Most institutions, I wrote a blog about this a few weeks ago, have got this not just a real conservatism, they've got an ambient conservatism. It comes through in a fear for change, in a slow process of movement. We're talking about what we're going to do in 2017-18 at the moment. The alternate is UCL have just done their thing called UCL 2034, which is so far out to not really be even committing themselves to anything. So you get this real conservatism in institutions, and they're like, that's a really good idea, but can we do it just a bit more slowly? So what we end up with is the support for teams like mine to do lots and lots of little projects for 20 students, for 30 students, because they're quite safe to do those. But you also have a real sense of risk aversion. So there's a real fear in vice chancellors, and having sat with vice chancellors, there's a real fear from vice chancellors to do something institutionally risky, because their position is almost entirely predicated on what the league table position is that year. My former vice chancellor set a target for the university to become into the top 50. You're on a hiding to nothing. You do it, fantastic. If you don't, and unfortunately, you can look at their position in the last Guardian league tables, and he didn't. His position becomes very difficult. So for him, risk aversion is built into every practice. Well, you've got to deliver me the top 50. You have to deliver me the alumni donation. You have to deliver me the student achievement. You have to deliver me the widening participation agenda, or whatever the particular agenda for that institution is. Most of the pedagogy that these institutions then use to do this is 20th century. Some people argue 19th century pedagogy. There's been a lot of debate around the sort of predominance of the lecture. I met the vice chancellor teaching, pro-vice chancellor, or vice provost, sorry, teaching and learning at Harvard, who I asked the simple question, how did you deal with the predominance of the lecture? He said, we did. We just stopped doing them in many fields. So you can do a number of, and the classic one I think is Comp 101 or Comp 100, which is their compulsory coding course for undergraduate students at Harvard. There are no lectures in that. It's a massive tutorial of about 300 people all working on computers with 50 GTAs and staff working with them, and then working with each other, but there is no single person lecture. There have been critical shifts in the way information is acquired and applied, which universities are struggling with. Anyone who comes from a library background will know this. And there is actually some student resistance to our use of technology. There's enough evidence out there that say that students don't like us making them use their Facebook for our education. So one of the things that a piece of research was done, I think by Rona Sharp, I'll have to double check that, which asked students about what do they expect from their university experience? Well, they expect lectures. Well, why do you expect lectures? Because that's what my parents told me university education was about. So there's a kind of built stereotype in there. What do you expect to use your technology for? Well, I'm paying £9,000 fees. I shouldn't be expected to use my technology. I should be expected to be given technology to use if they're expecting me to do it. And that's why students will use the VLE, because it's technology that's given to them. And institutions use that data consistently to justify, well, we're using the VLE, why do we want to do anything more? On the other hand, students themselves are slightly different in the way they do learning, and they come to the institution as e-learners. School is teaching this. It is through the way they acquire information. So the simple example is Wikipedia. You ask a 17-year-old about something, they know how to go to Wikipedia, they know how to get it, they walk through the gates of the institution and they're told two things. They're told, don't use your laptop in the lecture, this is a closed laptop lecture. And they exist. I don't know about this institution, they certainly exist in other institutions. Or if they're told not to close their laptop, they've got a lecture theatre where they can't actually use their laptop. It's so small they can't fit. There's no power. And in one institution I know, Wi-Fi is not on in that lecture theatre. There are no Wi-Fi routers in that lecture theatre at all, on the direct request, apparently, of other students. But they're also told that Wikipedia is kind of a bad thing for you to be using. That working with someone, collaboratively, as you've gone and asked the crowd for opinion, if you don't do it right, could well be collusion. You've got to be careful about that. And internet sources, they're hard to validate. And they're hard to justify. And so there's a real tension that happens with students coming into the institution who have learnt how do we learn through practice, because that's the way information is accessed these days, and then be told something different when they arrive. It doesn't mean what they're told is wrong, but there's a lack of recognition that what they have has validity as much as the modes that they're being told. They're using 21st century skills. A brilliant writer from the US called Henry Jenkins talks a lot about 21st century skills. And most of what he talks about is how students are learning to be citizens in the digital age and what it means to be a responsible citizen. Learning is part of being a responsible citizen. Yet those 21st century skills aren't built into most curricula. Certainly in the 6 years I've been in the United Kingdom, transferable skills have almost vanished from most curricula. And we have become ever and increasingly more Humboldtian in our acceptance of the discipline as superior to anything else. I don't know about this institution. How many different research methodologies courses are there in this institution? Would every discipline have their own research methodologies course? LSE has 24 departments. It has 47 different methodologies courses. And that's just at postgraduate level. That does not include PhD students. There's commonalities in there. Stupid thing is we actually have a methodology institute as well that doesn't teach anything across any of the other disciplines. Very strange, except in stats. For most of our students, this separation between the real and online world doesn't exist. It's just the world. We are dealing with just the world. This is their world. Yet we still talk about online learning and e-learning, and we talk about it as something that's different. What students consider to be authentic and real and what they trust is very different to what, certainly when I went to university, we were told to trust. And I'll explore that a little bit later. It is certainly true to point out that not all students are experts in all technologies. Students become experts in the technology that's relevant to them at the time. You know, I think it's a poor assumption to assume that everybody is, because by virtue of being 18, is an expert in every piece of technology. They're not. But institutions often then, when they talk about e-learning, talk about it in that way, oh, you can do anything because students can use all this technology. It's us that can't. I think this point is probably the most important to point out, is that student adoption of technology is happening at a far faster rate of an institution's ability to adapt to that. You know, we are still talking about, at the LSE, a Wi-Fi network capable of dealing with BYOD that is going to be 3 years away. Lord knows what BYOD is going to look like in 3 years. So the institution's ability to catch up to student adoption of technology. Most institutions, and we talk about BYOD, most institutions haven't dealt with BYOD particularly well because they have no way of adapting to it. You know, I went to one institution, I was at one institution where they were talking about BYOD and they said, well, we will allow BYOD on these 4 devices. If you don't use those 4 devices, then we're not going to allow it. How does that work? Anyway, what this results itself in a very simple way, is it results itself in this, I think, slightly simplistic argument, but I'll go with it anyway. Modern pedagogy is in many ways quite scaffolded, sequential, aligned, and structured. If we want to look at this in terms of media, what this represents itself, I think, is that a lot of our teaching and learning is quite episodic. It's the way we used to watch television. We'd watch television, we'd wait a week till the next thing was to come on. There was no internet to spoil it. You couldn't download it. I remember back in maybe 91 getting some giant printed piece of paper with someone who downloaded the sort of synopses of the next 5 Star Trek episodes from 1989. That was as far as we got. Modern media consumption isn't like that. We consume information in binges and in bites. You know, there's whole guides out there about how you can binge the whole 5 seasons of Breaking Bad in one weekend. Now that's media consumption that's different. You know, I think the average YouTube video is 2 minutes, 12 seconds or some figure like that. Information is consumed by our students in different ways. Yet we continue to say, look, thanks for coming to our lecture. At the end of this week, you'll now have to wait till next week to get the next part. So it is quite sequenced and structured. Unfortunately, the way students live, work, play, and love isn't, or rarely is anyway. That's a picture, by the way, from a museum in Zagreb in Croatia called the Museum of Broken Relationships, which is probably the single most fascinating museum I've ever been in. And it's a picture of a letter that was written to a woman from her then partner to break up with her. So how did she deal with this? It's a very traumatic event. She glued it to a mirror and smashed it. Because in her mind, the putting of such a bad thing on a mirror wouldn't give her 7 years bad luck. It was going to give her 7 years good luck. That's not a particularly sequential or logical thing to do. Yet that's the way we live and work our lives. Education doesn't seem to map to that particularly well. And it's built up on this, and there are people who talk about this, it's built up on this notion that students, when they arrive at institutions, are empty vessels. And the job of higher education is to fill those empty vessels with knowledge. Yet students bring with them experiences, and they bring with them life that is often not applied to their learning, particularly at undergraduate level. And I will preface it with that. So I wrote a paper about a year ago called The Logical Impossibility of the Status Quo, or just the Logical Impossibility Status Quo. That is, for those of you who know status quo, they don't look like that anymore, funnily enough. And the reason I wrote this is that in the context of higher education, thinking about the way we do things now and thinking that we're going to be doing exactly the same thing in 20 years just makes no sense. So to me, it was the logical impossibility of the status quo. And I'll just briefly give you the sort of 6 disconnects that came from this. And these disconnects were things that I subtitled as demanding a debate about having a pedagogy for the modern age. And the first of those was about what is knowledge and the nature of knowledge. If we go back, and here I am saying Socratic traditions, I'll go back to Plato. And Plato argues that knowledge needed 3 things. He said, for something to be knowledge, it needs to be justified, true, and believed. So when I went to university in the late 80s, how was that done? It was done by an academic getting a book for which it was justified. It had been edited. Someone had looked at it, published it. That was justified knowledge. It was told to me by an academic. The academic had selected that and said, I'm going to tell you this as an opinion on the body of theory that we're looking at. It's validated. And in some senses, the truth came from the fact that if I wrote it back in the exam, I got passed. There's the truth. That's knowledge. That is not knowledge in the modern world. Sure, there is knowledge that is justified like that. But as Henry Jenkins said, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, the ability to know everything is no longer an aspirational impossibility. It is a physiological impossibility. You know, and how does that look in a modern university? PhDs used to be that you exhausted the body of knowledge in your area. You had to write, you had to literally have said, I've read literally as much as I could, everything. That can't be done anymore. No discipline allows you to read everything. So then you get into a value judgment about what are the important things? What contributes to my argument? What are the sort of relevant bits of knowledge from other fields, the sort of transdisciplinarity and the interdisciplinarity that build into that? It's changed the notion of knowledge. What this has done, and I don't know if any of you are sort of fans of alternative media, but my PhD is in zines. So I write about how zines, independent publications, are used to build community, form communities, affect political action and stuff like that. The dream of the zine in the 70s and 80s is rent large by the internet. It allows people to form communities, crowdsource information. I'll talk about a project which crowdsourced a policy document. What it has done, it has emancipated knowledge. Now, there are problems associated with that. I'm not going to argue there aren't. Of course there are. It would be stupid to think otherwise. But what's not stupid is to think the fact that perhaps the way knowledge is acquired has changed. That means maybe we need to look at the way we use knowledge. The purpose of university has shifted. We know that. We know that the notion of being at a university to sort of, you know, to develop as a person has shifted. I'm not sure about your vice chancellors. Certainly other vice chancellors at other institutions are saying they will only fund things that enhance student employability. And courses have become driven by employable skills. There's a wonderful quote by, what's his name? Daniel Stacey, who was a student at the University of Technology in Sydney. And he said, the fact is, you read for your degree. You don't need to sit and listen. You just need to read and occasionally join in tutorials to purloin ideas from other students. He got a first-class degree in law from that institution. Now, whether he actually did that or not, is slightly questionable. The professor of, I think he's professor of astrophysics at Columbia University in the US, David Helfand, did a TED talk about the purpose of university. And he said that when he asked his students what their purpose for being at university was, Their answer was, I think, quite a simple one. I am here for a degree, not for an education. So there are different purposes. Now, we may not agree with those purposes, and therefore what we do inside our teaching and learning should actually shape why they could be there and should be there. But there is a tension, and I call these disconnects for a reason. The disconnect isn't what should and shouldn't be happening. The disconnect is what is happening. There is this disconnect, and how do we deal with this? You know, you look at student satisfaction in the NSS, almost all of it is based around value. There's a value proposition for there. Am I getting appropriate feedback? Yes, to enhance my performance. On the other hand, I'm paying £9,000 fees. What value do I get from this? Now, I'm not arguing the right or wrongness of this, but I am arguing this has an impact. This tension has an impact on the way we think about education. Yes, there's a big argument around whether we're preparing students for jobs that don't actually exist, and that's quite real. But in many ways, this tension and this disconnect is impacting a little bit on the way courses are constructed. And if you look at the way the QAA validation process sort of constructs employability into there, it talks about employability today. It's about what would be required if that student went out there today in order to do that. 3 years later, that skill's going to be different. This is a really interesting one. Modern internet searching is not about the answer. Modern internet searching is about the question, because with the enormous amount of information out there, you need to know how to ask the right question. Most university assessment is about the answer. It's about how do you replicate the right answer. So there's quite a disconnect that occurs there. Let's erase through these. One is the ubiquity of technology. The next one is the ubiquity of technology, and the fact that there is an inordinate amount of technology out there with students that are using it every day. But interestingly, and I actually made this point when I was talking to Sylvester earlier, what I find fascinating of academics who resist using technology in their, the LSE in their provision are usually the most advanced users of technology in their research. They have brilliant blog presences. They have amazing Twitter feeds. You might have editors to do that for them. They have, you know, they use high performance computing in their data analysis. They use all of this technology. But then when it's in the classroom, yeah, one of those academics said to me, and this was a direct quote, "Students will learn simply by the power of my words." It makes it very, very difficult. And I also point out the other disconnect, which is that forced use of what is students' technology. I use it when I do this as a bigger thing. I use an example of there's some research that said students are sometimes quite embarrassed by the way academics use things like Facebook. It's because they've been using Facebook as a user for half a decade and are quite comfortable with it, and it's a bit uncomfortable. And one of the quotes I saw, which I thought was brilliant, it's like watching your grandmother twerk at your 18th birthday party, which I thought was an absolutely brilliant descriptor of it. I don't twerk at any of the parties. It's just not a good thing. And finally, there's a difference in language. I would refer to this as speaking in tongues. In some ways, this is a conflict of expectation. And this kind of summarizes all of that debate around what is the purpose of university, what is the purpose of learning, why am I here, all of those more philosophical questions. But it also goes back to, I think, one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating. There was a piece of research done by a US academic published about 8 months ago around data that came out of the network analysis of a lecture theatre and looked at what websites were being looked at in the network. And go figure, 77% of students were using Facebook. And they're like, well, that just proves that they're not listening. And then when you start to interrogate that, you say, well, what were they actually using Facebook for? I have Facebook on my computer. It's probably sitting on that in the background now. I'm not using it. So do we take that out of the mix? The second part of that is, when I was at university, I know I was writing notes to the people in front of me constantly about, look at that person, what's this person doing? Oh, that girl's not looking at me. I wanted to look at me. Wouldn't that be real? All that kind of stuff. Most of the use of Facebook in most lectures, and there's research that proves this, is students talking to each other, communicating through a back channel. And a lot of it is actually, I just didn't get what that person said. What the hell did that mean? And they're teaching each other. That's not a bad thing. Yet there's this debate that says, well, if the laptop is up, like in that picture there, where you're faced with a sea of laptops, they're just skiving off it. They're just looking at the internet. No, they're not. There's a brilliant example at what came from University of Greenwich, and the University of Greenwich had a fairly major tragedy occur at it about 7 or 8 years ago, which was the murder of one of the students at the university and the son of one of the administrators at the school, Stephen Lawrence, if anyone remembers the Stephen Lawrence case. The law lecturer about 6 months after, one of the law lecturers 6 months after that happened, wanted to have a discussion about it in the context of what he was teaching. And he said, look, I asked a question and got no answers. In a lecture theatre of 250 people, not a single person answered a question. It was raw, it was painful, it was something they didn't want to talk about. So he said, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to go back to your social network, whatever you use. You can do it in your dinner table, you can talk, just ask your friends, you know, this question. And he posed the question. The next week, he could not stop the debate because people were not talking about their opinion. They were saying, but my mate said, you know, it was a couple of white guys that did this. And then you start getting into what the learning's actually about. So don't get into a debate about whether they're not using technology not to learn. Use the technology to help them learn. So what that leads to is, I think, and this is sort of the crux for me, what this leads to is a fairly interesting discussion around what does the digital pedagogy look like in the modern age. I've sort of thrown those 7 words up there. They're the things for me that are built on the idea that learning is a construct of experiences, and each of those is an experience. Something about, you know, found, and I'll talk about that one in a minute, about making, identity, play, discontinuity, authenticity, and a sense of community. This is not new. None of this is new. This all builds on, things like discontinuity. Piaget talked about discontinuity in the 20s and learning through sort of discontinuity, chaotic experience. You know, Knowles talked about andragogy and the notion of adults self-constructing their own learning. So this isn't new. This isn't rocket science. But I just want to focus on 3. The first I want to focus on is found. I find found fascinating. In my artistic practice, everything I do is about found, whether it's found sounds, found fragments, found video. The way I make video for my art pieces is I just film wherever I go. I have thousands of pieces of film. And when I've written something and I need a film, I just go and grab bits of film that I've filmed. It's not been filmed for the purpose, but I've constructed a narrative through the film. Most of the sounds I use are found sounds, 1930s classical records, scratches and scuffs complete. I do a lot of stuff where I just record various, you know, I had one of the bass lines I used in a piece was a broken escalator in Gare du Nord in Paris. You know, found, I think, is a really interesting concept. Now, for me, found is also about discovery. It's about finding stuff. In some ways, modern pedagogy, existing pedagogy doesn't allow discovery. It's kind of already a discovered country. We know what the information is. You're going to read it, consume it, and replicate it. But bricolage and discovery are really important concepts. So that's just something out of a piece that I wrote. And what's really interesting is that photo, that was a small piece of overhead transparency that said, getting really angry and not knowing why. I found that on the road. I don't know why someone would have written on a tiny piece of overhead transparency, getting really angry and not knowing why. And I was fascinated why someone would write that. Like, what led to that writing? And through that, I actually wrote a whole piece about it and then used it in there. But what does that mean in terms of higher education? It means that sometimes we teach problems without solutions. We ask questions without answers. We don't actually know what is going to happen when we do something. The difficulty is, that's brilliant. I could sort of talk about that for ages. But in real terms, what does that mean? So at the LSE, we're doing a project called the Learning Teaching Technology Futures Project. It's about transforming curricula and teaching in what is an essentially very conservative institution. What we have started with is a project we've called LSE 2020. The idea, and of course, we just ripped that off UCL, but we're a lot more realistic than 2034. So we went with the idea of, you know, we could run a consultation project. We could go out there, we could have a discussion, we could have like a standard consultation. We don't want to do that. What we want to do, and it's based a little bit on what's done by Georgetown University in the US. What they did is they said, you know what, we don't know what we should be doing. So the Vice Chancellor said, you know, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to run hacks. I'm going to do problem solution sessions. He ran an unconference with first-year students. This is the vice chancellor, or the provost in their instance. And he offered money, he offered prizes, he had free pizza and not free beer because 21 and all that kind of stuff in the US. But he had all of that stuff going. And he said, the main thing I wanted to do this for is I didn't know what was going to come out of it. So sometimes found can manifest itself in a variety of different ways. For us, that's the way we want to see it. And quite interestingly, we chose images for this. We got one of our a designer, a sort of first-year student designer, to do these for us. And quite interesting, when we explained this to her, she took the idea of using paper cuts, which is such a beautiful piece around found and bricolage, because a lot of the practice of bricolage in art is about, it comes from scrapbooking and paper cutting and all those kind of practices. And that's built beautifully into that. But the key thing at an institutional level is doing something that you didn't know the answer to, that you want to find something, and then making activities that follow from that sort of learning about that. Second one I wanted to focus on was identity. I think identity is critical to modern teaching, and it's quite challenging to get students to engage in a debate around the notions of identity and realness. But these are also at the core of my own artistic work as well. I'm fascinated by identity. I'm absolutely fascinated by, there's a theory around, well, it's known as the online disinhibition theory, and it's about how disinhibited people come by not using their own identity online. And then also there's a dark side to that. So there's a positive side of that, but then there's the dark side of the behaviours that come from that. And I write a fair bit about that, both professionally and in my practice. But I think what's really interesting about it is that it builds the ability of students to realise that there are varying levels of connection they can make and learn from. We talk a lot about lasting connections. There is quite a power to fleeting connections, to where they just see a student for one lesson and they work with them on that and they never talk to them again. And that sort of fleeting connection. A lot of what Siemens and Downes, who are the sort of progenitors of MOOCs, talk about when they talk about their learning theory called connectivism, is the power of the fleeting connection, the power of just making a very loose tie with someone, and from that building, sort of being exposed to something you've never been exposed to before. What was interesting from the project that we ran that I want to talk about that's connected to this was that identity was almost, the sort of fleeting connections was quite critical to it. The LSE has been running a project for the last 2.5 years about trying to crowdsource the UK Constitution, and particularly in this, the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, it's a very prescient time to do so. Their previous attempts were okay. We had a big Constitution Carnival, about 200 people. We had an online platform that had about 50 people, but was taken down by a single troll who just basically said that they want the Queen dead on every... so what do you think about regional garbage collection at councils? I want the Queen dead. That was the response all the way through. So they had to shut the platform down. They came to us and said, can you make this work? We said, sure, but what we're really interested in is a whole lot of other things that are not just about crowdsourcing the Constitution. We're really interested in informal learning. We're interested in how people learn from the community. What we were fascinated by is how do you actually leverage the power of the massive? MOOCs are massive by virtue of the fact that they are collections of individuals. Whereas what we wanted to know is you get 1,500 people in a room, that's pretty damn powerful. How do you make that work? So we ran a platform that did that. We had 1,500 people. We generated nearly 900 ideas for clauses for a constitution. We had 24,000 votes, and we had about 1,800 comments in an 8-week period. We had a dropout rate of less than 40%. We had people who put ideas up and came back at the end. We had people who stayed the entire way. We had a semi-gamified approach to a sort of league table that encouraged participation. And what did we get at the end? We got a crowdsourced constitution. What was fascinating was the way people represented themselves. We asked for no demographic data. We asked for no socioeconomic. We asked them to give their name, their age, and did they think we should have a constitution or not? That was it. over 50% of people did not identify themselves as anything other than some sort of historical reference, some sort of political. We had Liberal Annie, we had Boadicea, although interestingly, Boadicea was an American man, slightly counterintuitive to the notion of Boadicea anyway. But identity was critical because they felt they could contribute to this debate. Because unlike, for example, Facebook at the moment, which is having a massive debate around transgendered people not using their real name, identity is critical to people's engagement in an online environment, whether it's critical that they identify or critical they don't. And finally, I just want to talk about making. So I think making is one of those really fascinating ones because it is connected to practice. I think making is fundamental to how I personally choose to live my life. It's a philosophical approach to the way I holiday, the way I do my art, the way I engage, the way I work. PhD is around people who make and make zines. But that notion of both physical tactility, and I think there is a digital tactility as well, the physicality to digital making, all appears through the way I work. But what's interesting is that most pedagogy positions making as a form of practice and then separates theory from practice. And I think lectures and exams are a good example of that. We lecture about the theory of making. And then we kind of even, in some instances, don't assess making. We kind of make making a formative process that the end result is not to actually make, which is kind of strange in some instances. Maybe not in creative art, in creative practice, but certainly in social sciences, that's the case. So for me, what this leads to is a project which we build around students as producers. It's something I know Helen has done a lot of stuff around, and certainly the twice Helen's come to the different institutions I've had, that's inspired a lot of people to look at students as producers as quite emancipatory practice around curricula. For us, and I'll just briefly talk about this, this is not just simply about getting students to make content. This is about students co-creating knowledge, students co-constructing curricula. This is about students being involved in the design of their own learning spaces. It's about students participating in the discussions with academics. I saw this brilliantly stupid example of an academic who said, I'm flipping my lectures now. So what I've done is I've done all this work, I've recorded my lectures, students watch it beforehand, and when they walked into their classroom, this was their single contribution to the flip. So you've all watched the lecture, yep, so anyone got any questions? And that was it. That was the end of the flip. There's more to it than that. There's construction of knowledge that comes from that. In some ways, this sort of leads me to the last thing I want to talk about, which is how does this work at an institutional level, which is the real difficulty of this. Because you could do this at 20 people, 5 people, 10 people, that's easy. But how do you do it at an institutional level? Most people try one of two methods. The bottom-up method, lots and lots of 30 people projects that eventually will tip the institution's practices. It rarely does. Then there's the top-down diktat where you get the Vice Chancellor who says, you will do this. That rarely works as well. So what both Barack Obama and anyone who's a fan of the American TV show Silicon Valley talked about, and I will not give the example of what Silicon Valley used in the context of From the Middle Out, is how do we pick topics and courses and cohorts and programs that are big enough and substantive enough to impact the entire organization. Harvard invested 30 million American dollars in teaching and learning last year, 30 million. And they said the one single project that had the greatest impact of all was $50,000 they gave to their Nobel laureate physics professor to do one very simple shift in his teaching, to move away from lecture tutorial, to move to something that's actually more problem-based. Really simple. But why did that have an impact? It was the physics professor who'd won the Nobel Prize. It was a person who everyone looked at, well, if they can do it, why can't I? Now, it wasn't particularly innovative, it wasn't particularly, transformative, but God, it had an impact. It's about picking the right circumstances that have those impacts. At an institutional level, that's how you can bring about these kind of changes. So what are we doing? We're starting to work with cohorts, with programs. We're starting to work with large first-year courses, which have a particular impact. We work with what's called LSE 100, which is our sort of transdisciplinary first-year course that every first-year student has to do. We work with these things that have potential impact. We're working with our first-year economics course, which has got a huge problem with students coming in with A-star economics or no economics, all trying to do first-year economics. and the arguments that happen in those classes. Brilliant opportunity to come in and make some change. And if we can do that for EC 102, God, we can do it for anything. So from the middle out says there is a different way, and it's not a combination of top down and bottom up. It's about scale, and it's about, in some senses, doing exactly what we do with the Constitution UK project, leveraging the power of the massive. And that's kind of the way it manifested itself in terms of the project that we're working on. It's called the Futures Project, and it aims to build an engaged, innovative and critical teaching and learning community at the LSE through those kind of things, building a culture of innovation, making it safe to fail and experiment, which is massively needed in most institutions, rewarding people who do good things, rewarding people who do bad things, but have at least tried something. They're rewarding creativity, encouraging bold experimentation. This, what looks, I think, relatively simple, but for an institution like the LSE, that got welcomed through every part of the LSE governance, from court, council, directors management team, departments, every single one of them said, hell yeah. So it's quite, you know, when you actually make a persuasive argument that says we're going to do this and we're going to do this in a way that will benefit our students, institutions do buy it. So finally, I just want to end on two simple quotes. One is from Patti Smith, the masterful punk poetess and performer who I just saw last weekend in Spain in Primavera. These two lessons are simple. I was at Patti Smith's concert about 10 years ago, and sitting in a row, second row, with a mate of mine next to me. Patti Smith jumps off the stage. If anyone knows her songs, her final song is a cover of Them's Gloria. It's incredibly passionate. She screams her lungs out. Her guitarist and her interact. It's intense. So she jumps off stage and she gets down right in front of the person there and she looks at him and she starts exhorting him, this is a friend of mine, to get up and dance. Come on, get up and dance with Patti Smith. And he sits there and three things went through his mind. The first thing was, should I sit there and look like a dick? Should I get up and dance and look like a dick? Or what he ended up doing, which is he just sat there and waved his hands around like this. The logic of that story is, you know, go home or go hard or go home. You know, it's great that you sort of dip your toe into the water, but the next step of dipping your toe in the water is actually doing something that is actually experimental, and knowing that your institution will support you to do that and support you if it doesn't work. The next quote is why I called this piece Little Arguments with Myself. Well, the actual piece is called Little Argument with Myself. It took me ages to work out this lyric. But for me, what this lyric actually means is that you're never going to change everything yourself. I mean, the lyric says, if those can't read it, just keep counting the stars, like someday you'll find out just how many there are, because when we all can go home because there's nothing as sad as a man on his back counting stars. The idea, it used to frustrate me that in my roles as sort of changing institutional practice and supporting changing institutional practice, someone would then go and do something that would just be, why are they doing that? There was a meeting last week of a committee that said, we're going to now have a debate about should we ban online learning at the LSE? You know, and it's just like, huh? Why are we having this debate? I can't change that. But what I can do is encourage people to work with what they can change. And ultimately, as a sort of central service, my role is to work with people, to collaborate. But it's not just to collaborate with those people, it's to get people to collaborate with each other, both internally and externally from the academy. We're doing some brilliant work with a startup company in Shoreditch, not because what they're doing is particularly good, it's because they've got a bloody good way about thinking about innovation. Why shouldn't we be talking to them? Why shouldn't we be we're bringing him in to talk to with one of our projects we're working with to sort of even transform what they're doing even more. So there you go. That's me. And I shall end it there. Thank you.
Brilliant start to the afternoon. Thank you so much, Peter. I think there's probably going to be quite a few questions. I'm not sure what to do time-wise. We could maybe take one or two now and then have others over coffee.
Sure.
Or we get set up for the next session. That was really, really inspiring. Thank you. Has anyone got any questions for Pete? Everyone's gobsmacked. Sean? Oh, is that just
You're doing the Patti Smith thing, I know. It's my friend will kill me. I tell that story all the time, and he gets so embarrassed when I tell it.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Because it's something that I think we experience in. I'll shout, or do you need me to tell this one? Okay. Talking to the mic, eyes from Alex. Okay. Right. Is that? Oh, it's for Alex. Okay, you can. Yeah. I get it now. Right. Okay. So, in institutions, we are increasingly seeing, top levels of kind of governance and management support for taking risks, making mistakes, and all these things that we really need to do if we are actually going to kind of challenge existing practices. And yet, at the same time, it's quite hard to kind of operationalize that. Because of the systems we work within and the kind of external pressures, whether it's QA or NSS. Are you aware of anyone that's managed to kind of manage that tension successfully?
Short answer, no. I know people who have managed it in a way that achieves most of what they want to do. So, you can see it in individual departments, faculties working extraordinarily well. There's some brilliant stuff going on at, I think it's Leeds Met in their fashion design course, where they've completely transformed their VLE to being a front-facing gallery of students' work. And then that becomes a community engagement platform where people say, I really like your design from outside. And in that level, that's not just one program, that's a whole faculty's worth of programs. Whole institutional shifts, no, I've not seen particularly. Although outside of the UK, I mentioned Georgetown. Georgetown has completely transformed itself. And if any of you are interested, go and look at Georgetown's Redesigning the Universities of the Future project. It has, I went and visited their provost. They've changed everything. Curriculum changed, teaching changed. By virtue of that, their research profile shifted. Their student feedback went up, their alumni donations went up. All of the things that are critical to a US institution changed because the Vice Chancellor took a very proactive approach to saying, this is the unknown, we don't know what it is. So, US institutions are really hard to make the comparison because they've got more money, but as someone actually pointed out to me, that more money is also equally spent. In many ways, most US institutions that are rich are actually quite poor because they're spending that money. They've still got the same gap we all have to do new things because they've got, instead of 5 people in an e-learning team, they've got 30. So here, not as much, but certainly there. And in Australia, it's starting to, one institution that's worth having a look at is Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, which now has Martin Bean, who was the former Vice-Chancellor of the OU, as their Vice-Chancellor. The things they're starting to do with their flying faculty work in Singapore and Malaysia are tearing business away from mainstream universities in the UK, hand over fist, because it's about making the online learning environment so engaging and different that it's not simply a delivery point of materials. And the last one I'll use, and I think this is really interesting, is MIT. 85% of MIT face-to-face students do up to 30% of their learning on their, what they used to call their VLE, which is now not. It has no course administration in it anymore. It's the edX platform, which delivered their MOOCs. They use that in their normal face-to-face teaching every day. Students use that and learn on that. Why? It frees up 30% of faculty time to actually talk to students. And what they're then doing, and Columbia is doing the same thing, they're breaking down the standard educational logic that when you build a new building, you put students on the lower floor, academics cloistered on the upper floors. They're putting lecture theatres all the way through the building. So in order to get to the lecture theatre, students have to walk past academics' offices constantly. So it's building that interaction into the design of the building. So it's happening, but it's patchwork.
Yeah, brilliant. Billy.
You mentioned Biggs and how do you call structural
Constructive alignment.
constructive alignment. I was wondering if you think that's still relevant. If it isn't, why not? And if it is, why is it?
I think it shouldn't be the single dominant form of curricula and learning design. It definitely has relevance, because to do an assessment that does not help a student learn through that assessment doesn't really have much benefit to the student. To stand in front of a room and just chat aimlessly doesn't help deliver something for the student. So yes, learning outcomes to teaching design to assessment has benefit, but there's equal benefit that comes from discontinuity. I mean, Helen has written about this in a blog, and I wrote about it coincidentally in a blog as well, not knowing each other had written about the same thing, which was this brilliant piece of performance done by a London theatre company called Punch Drunk. And it's what they refer to as a sort of immersive theatre experience. But you enter this theatre experience at varying points in the play. The narrative is occurring up and down and through, like it was done in the old Paddington sorting offices at Paddington Station. And there was like 80 rooms, I think. And you could have entered in any of those 80 rooms and constructed the narrative. So there is something to be said for both the constructed narrative, but learning also is sometimes occurring in a very unstructured way. I think part of the problem we have is that the argument is almost always this polarized one versus the other. I think there's room for both. But if we are constantly saying, well, we'd like to do technology. Oh, so you want to get rid of all of us. Oh, you want to do lecture capture. Oh, you want to sack us all and replace us with videos. No, I don't want to do that. Well, some of you might want to, but not all of you. So how do you then have the debate that it's about finding the mix and finding the blend? And so, yes, constructive alignment makes sense. I taught on PG Certs in HE for a decade. I'd have a number of times I explained constructive alignment and never had a problem with it. But as I start to think through it, there's got to be something that can be added to it.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there now so that we can have our refreshment break and get started again at 2:30 with the Ignite presentations. So I think that's about 2:05 now. So thanks again, Peter,
Thank you.
and obviously